Mom digs through her son's grave and finds the unthinkable. Doris had every confidence that her son Bob, who'd been sent on a covert military assignment, would return home safely. Doris's life was turned upside down when two soldiers arrived at her door with a letter from Bob saying goodbye. In order to determine if the letter was genuine, she wanted to check for herself. Despite her best efforts, Doris could not have anticipated what she found when she opened the casket after digging up the grave of her son in the middle of the night with the help of her siblings. It's a horrific tale that will leave you dumbfounded and on the edge of your seats. After months of investigation, Doris and her team had finally found the answer to their question. Using flashlights, they dug through the graveyard at midnight. Doris was exhausted after hours of hard work, but she was determined to succeed. As they looked further, Doris felt excited and encouraged her friends to dig despite the cold. "We're nearly there." She had very high hopes of wanting to continue, regardless of what could happen. After hours of digging, Doris and her colleagues heard the sound of shovels striking wood. They realized they'd found Bob's casket. They stopped digging and stared at each other, hopeful and excited. They were excited as they meticulously cleaned it. They prayed for answers because whatever they discovered could change everything. They worked fast and carefully without disturbing the casket or its contents. They lifted the lid after what felt like a long time and revealed the truth. In a state of terror and excitement, she couldn't look away from the spectacle of the coffin being carried from the graveyard. This was the moment of truth, and she could hardly wait to find out what was inside. As the coffin lid was raised, Doris watched with fascination and anxiety. She constantly doubted what was to be discovered and felt something was amiss. She was shocked when she peeked inside. She muttered triumphantly, "I knew it." She uncovered the coffin. What did she see inside, though? It was obvious to Bob that he would join the army. He always wanted to serve his nation and mentor young people. He was motivated and ready to take on a military challenge. However, Bob's mother Doris didn't want him to fight overseas. Whenever she thought about Bob's safety and the threats he might encounter, she felt anxious. She couldn't stop him. She respected Bob's choice. She just prayed he would be safe when he returned. Despite her son's excitement, Doris hoped he would give up his army goal, but Bob only became more committed to joining the military with time. He studied and prepared for army life in every spare moment. Seeing Bob's intense interest in current battles and tactical operations, Doris saw that she couldn't change his mind. He would join the army no matter what, and there was nothing she could do. When Bob turned 18, he was ready to go to military school. He was prepared for a tough voyage and rigorous activities. He'd been practicing his whole life and was so excited to join. While she struggled to accept her son's decision, she realized she couldn't stop him. She watched Bob leave for military school with pride and regret, knowing he was starting a new chapter in his life. Since Bob was in great physical condition, he excelled in lessons and training. His professors quickly saw his ability and persistence. He was top in his class and worked hard to succeed. As a result of his perseverance and hard work, Bob graduated from military school early. Doris loved her son and believed he would succeed in the military. She still wasn't happy about it, but was very proud of him. Doris was proud of her son's military career despite her concerns. She knew he had fought hard to reach where he was, and she was pleased that his promotions had lessened the probability of him fighting on the front lines. After working hard, Bob was promoted to corporal. He was deployed immediately after the promotion. When Doris thought of Bob becoming a corporal and taking on greater duties and risks, she felt anxiety. She believed Bob would return home safely because he was strong and competent. As a soldier on perilous operations, Bob wrote a goodbye letter before going to war as a way to bring closure if something terrible happened. He took his letter seriously, unlike some soldiers. He never let anyone else read it, not even his closest friends. It was evident Bob took his letter seriously, and many of his friends were worried. The letter was personal for Bob, and he intended to keep it that way. Some thought it included a sincere farewell and wise comments, while others thought it was a practical document with his last wishes and funeral instructions. He had no influence on his selection. They put him on a squad with unfamiliar people, which made him feel uncomfortable. He had a feeling something was wrong and wondered what it was. As he prepared to enter the field, Bob couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong, and he wondered what was waiting for him. He was professional and committed to doing his job well. As a soldier, Bob had to obey orders. His mission was hidden from his family. His mother had no idea when he would return or what he was doing. That's something she'd never get used to. In the days that followed, Bob and his mother struggled with uncertainty and mental stress, but Bob kept his promise in mind. He had a goal in mind and wanted to follow his gut. To ensure confidentiality and deter espionage, Bob and his squad were not told their destination prior to their flight. Bob and his colleagues boarded the aircraft blindfolded, adding to documents that would later be released. As a rookie corporal, Bob had never been exposed to such harsh measures and wondered whether they were dealing with high-level spies. Despite his doubts, Bob concentrated on the objective and believed his boss's motives for secrecy. The squad boarded the aircraft prepared for any problems that might arise. His crew faced events and sensations beyond their comprehension, forcing them to confront their mortality in a new way. Witnessing such crimes forever changed them. As the days passed, Bob began to doubt his objective. He regretted leaving home. He felt he'd made a terrible mistake. He'd always been a loyal soldier, but now he wondered whether there were any other options. Despite being afraid, Bob knew he had to keep going. He wondered what he would see in this unfamiliar area and whether he'd ever be able to see his mother again. Their view was obscured by dust and dirt as they traveled to base camp the next day. They were exhausted after working continuously for days. A loud collision stopped the automobile as they traveled. Bob and his colleagues were caught off guard by gunfire and shouts. The adversary surrounded them in the automobile, leaving them defenseless. To survive, they had to move quickly. The sudden pain in Bob's back made him lose his vision. His crew screamed and shouted around him, and he realized they needed help. He tried to get up, but he was in too much pain. His strength and awareness were fading, and he felt as though he might die. He thought of his mother and all the things he wanted to have said to her, knowing he would never get to tell her how much he loved her again. In the midst of this awful torture, Bob desperately clung to life. The darkness overwhelmed him, and he knew he was going to die. After 2 days, Doris's doorbell rang. 2 military officers greeted Bob's mother. Doris instantly understood their serious demeanor, but it couldn't be real. That couldn't be happening. The news that her son Bob was gone forever had long been feared, as military officers generally indicated that a son or daughter had been killed in the line of duty. Doris broke when she learned of her son's death. 2 friendly military officers knocked on Doris's door again. They gave her time to process the painful news. She let them come in when she was calmed, and they gave her a note, a letter her son wrote. When Doris saw the letter, she glanced at it but couldn't read it. She put it in her bedside drawer and asked the officers to leave her alone to mourn. She was shocked and didn't know what to do. It was scheduled that the funeral would be held 2 days after the tragedy, but it had been postponed shortly. Doris contacted the military to find out why. Since she was unable to reach anyone, she had to wait for the military to explain. This was her first question regarding her son's death. Though she hoped the military would explain the delay, she realized it was her responsibility to find out what was actually going on. Over time, Doris became suspicious about the military's silence and the postponement of Bob's funeral. She needed to read her son's parting letter. It would be hard for her to read, but she needed to know what Bob wanted to say before he died. As she walked upstairs, she locked the door to her bedroom. As she read the letter from her nightstand, she took a deep breath and read it, expecting to find closure and accept her son's death, but what she found instead shocked her. After realizing the letter was real, Doris tucked it beneath her pillow. Instead of a personal note or closing advice, the letter contained something she couldn't believe, and she didn't know what to do. Lying in bed, tears streaming down her face, Doris wondered why her son had written such an appalling and unexpected letter. It was the last thing she expected from him, but something wasn't right. As a result of reading her son's letter, Doris lost all trust in the military. She felt misled and disillusioned. She was right all those years, and she felt really responsible for it. She should have never let her son go. Although she was sad and in disbelief at her son's funeral, Doris attended it with pride, honoring his life and efforts. Her astonishment and anger at the letter's contents made her try to accept such awful things were happening in the military institution she had previously admired. When Doris gazed into the eyes of the soldiers who brought her son's letter, she saw their apprehension. They were fidgeting and averting their gaze as if hiding or fearing being discovered. Doris wondered if they had read the letter and felt guilty or embarrassed. It was also possible the mail had been opened and the note read before she received it. The envelope's seal may have been changed to reveal the letter's secrets. Doris distrusted the officers and knew something was wrong. After the visitors left, Doris noticed the 2 military officers who'd watched her throughout the funeral didn't approach or express their condolences. They avoided her and stayed on the fringes of the gathering. Doris was surprised as she had expected them to show compassion or condolences. She wondered if the 2 officers who came to her house didn't even approach her after the funeral. Despite the support of friends and family, Doris felt utterly isolated following her son's funeral. It dawned on her that she must take action to commemorate his memory and seek justice for his distressing disclosure. Then it hit her, she couldn't go through it alone. Although powerless, she decided to commemorate her son's sacrifice. As she began the process of honoring her son, emotion suddenly overwhelmed her. Tears streamed down her face as she silently said goodbye to him for the last time. While she wasn't the most attentive or helpful sister, Doris realized she needed to respect her son and seek justice for the troubling things he said. Her son definitely deserved better. Despite her concerns about the future, she vowed to honor her son and fight for justice. She contacted her siblings and requested they meet with her the next day. She had a plan and needed all the help she could get. During a conversation at her eldest brother's house the next day, Doris told her 2 brothers and sister about her son's last letter. Her brothers were horrified and demanded to see it. The sister of Doris knew something was strange when she read it. The siblings read the letter together and pledged to respect their sister and seek justice for their horrific discoveries. Their goal was to stop this injustice by finding out the truth and bringing the perpetrators to justice. Despite their efforts, Doris's siblings never understood why Bob wrote such a damaging letter in his last hours. She gave them 30 minutes to digest it. They read it from cover to cover at least 5 times to comprehend her son's motives and verify the charges. In order to seek justice for Doris's son, the siblings knew they needed additional proof to prove it was authentic. They were determined to honor Bob and reveal the truth no matter what it took. As a last resort, Doris suggested exhuming her son's casket to discover the truth. She was reluctant to suggest it because it was strange and perhaps illegal, but she believed it was the only way to find the truth and honor her son. They decided to proceed but realized they had to be discreet to prevent a controversy. Her siblings were disgusted and thought it was insulting, but she believed it was the only way to verify the letter. Digging up a cemetery, even if done by a family member, disturbs the tranquility at a cemetery and disrespects the deceased. It is possible to face more severe repercussions if the grave is a military grave. As a result, Doris and her siblings realized they had to behave discreetly and carefully. If the burial wasn't restored by sunrise, they'd be found and punished. They were prepared to risk everything to get the truth. During the day, Doris and her siblings prepared a timetable and gathered shovels, pickaxes, and flashlights to work effectively and quietly. When their mission approached, Doris was terrified. She feared someone might see them and announce their doings to the police, resulting in serious repercussions. The brothers tried to calm her down, knowing they had to remain focused and motivated to achieve their goal. They all stayed committed to finding the truth and respecting Bob regardless of the hazards. In this assignment, Doris, who's usually calm, was out of character. She needed frequent breaks throughout the night to recover from the mental and physical toil. She questioned whether digging up her son's grave was the right thing to do. She was angry, unhappy, and determined to find the truth and respect her son, so she sobbed many times as she struggled with her emotions. It all happened so fast, but she knew what she needed to do. After digging deeper into the cemetery, Doris realized they were doing the right thing and wanting to find the truth to honor her son and seek justice. It's the last thing he deserved after all he gave to the military. A smile spread across Doris's face as she remembered her two digging brothers' support and tenacity. That's the goal, she thought. In spite of dangers and hardships, Doris knew the only way to honor her son and find peace was to accomplish their purpose. After 4 hours of digging, Doris and her siblings heard their shovels strike something. As they approached Bob's casket, Doris saw her son's lacquered wooden coffin reflecting the full moon. She was overcome by sadness as she knew the truth about her son's supposed death was about to be revealed. In spite of her concerns and uncertainties, Doris knew completing the mission was the only way to honor her son and find peace after his tragic death. A crowbar was used to pry open the coffin, and a loud bang echoed throughout the room as Doris and her brothers cleaned the lid and scraped dirt off the sides while making sure no one was there. The wood creaked more than they intended. Despite her fears, Doris felt they must continue to search for the truth. She breathed in and braced herself. She had to get what she'd been looking for, and there was only one way. Despite Doris's initial commitment, she and her siblings opened the casket without getting caught because no one heard their loud noises. They gasped when the wooden lid was lifted and they discovered what was inside. Her siblings were convinced that they were on the right track and had to move forward to find the truth. Doris was determined to finish the job despite her doubts. There was only one way to learn. After opening the casket, Doris was shocked. She said, "I knew it," despite her overwhelming emotions, but a tear fell from her cheek as she spoke, revealing her despair and loss. Her brothers stared at the casket in horror. It shocked and confused them. How? They closed the lid again, knowing they had to rebury the coffin to honor Bob's memory. While grieving, Doris and her siblings realized they had to remain strong in their fight for justice. They hurried to rebury their son and cover the grave, leaving no trace that they'd been there. When they finished, they fled with their tools. She already had the answers she needed. Seeing a dark, suspicious automobile heading toward the cemetery, the gang realized they had to escape before they were caught. They hopped over the gate and hurried toward the truck. Trying to avoid detection, they got into the vehicle and drove away fast. After their mission, Doris's brothers took her home and said farewell before returning home themselves. She was thankful for their assistance and for taking chances to help her find out the truth about her son. After closing her front door, Doris went to her office to write down and reflect on the findings she'd made. Although she feared for her safety, she knew it was risky to reveal the truth. In an effort to help her son and others who had suffered from corruption and injustice, she sat down at her desk and typed, determined to tell the world about her son's death and his frightening farewell letter. After jotting down her findings and copying her son's farewell letter, Doris realized she had to act quickly. She printed the complete story and sent it to a local newspaper, hoping they'd publish it. To respect her son and disclose the truth, she was prepared to take a risk. By not allowing them to get away with what they did to her son, she showed the military that she would seek justice. In the city, Doris's tale was published 2 days after she gave it to the newspaper. She was happy and scared because she knew revealing the truth would have terrible repercussions. The officers arrived at her house the same day as the story ran to greet her and congratulate her for her courage. Doris thanked them and told them she had a surprise in store for them. In order to protect herself and her family, she was determined to use all of her resources to obtain justice, and she knew she had to remain vigilant and keep one step ahead of them. After being questioned by 2 unfamiliar policemen in a military interrogation chamber, Doris realized she had to answer their questions carefully to avoid disclosing too much information. She sent her letter anonymously to the newspaper so no one would know she alerted the press to her son's distressing last message. As the cops questioned her, she remained calm, knowing that the more she told them, the greater the risk she would face. She wanted to survive the interview without revealing too much or endangering herself. Following 15 minutes of questioning, Doris realized she couldn't keep lying, so she thought presenting the cops with a letter would convince them she wasn't. They needed to do something. The police were perplexed as she took the note Bob had written her out of her pocket and placed it on the table. "Read it," Doris said, hoping the letter would prove her honesty and seriousness. A cop was speechless after reading the letter. "Ma'am, Doris interrupted him to make her point. To make sure they understood the seriousness of the situation and her plea, she said sharply, "You'll do everything in your power to get my kid back to the United States." As the cops sat silently, unsure of how to respond, Doris's request had to be taken seriously and all that could be done to honor her son's memory and bring justice to his family. She returned home after the interrogation without much knowledge of what would happen next. She eagerly awaited the police and military and any evidence that her son was alive. She was a step closer to know the whole truth. It was her determination to remain strong and find the truth, even though she knew it would be a long and painful journey that kept her from giving up hope they might bring her son back or bring justice to her son's murder. After weeks of waiting, Doris had lost hope of seeing her son again. She understood it would be a pipe dream. Then she received an unexpected letter from the military. They'd found her son but wasn't sure if he was alive or not. As Doris opened the letter, scared and hoping, she had to remain strong and believe. She prayed her kid was alive and she could bring him home. That was everything she needed to be happy again. As Doris watched the windows over the following few days, hoping for a sign from her son, she was delighted to receive the military letter. She was glad to receive an answer and to know the military was searching for her son. She watched the car approach, hoping it was her son home. Doris wondered if this was the moment the truth would be revealed to her. She couldn't wait any longer. As Bob stepped out of the black automobile and approached her front door, Doris was surprised and delighted. She called his name and ran to the door. Was it really him? She hurled herself at Bob, embracing him and crying with relief as he entered. Bob gently pulled her away and Doris saw him laughing through his tears. She laughed, revealed to have her child back home. Bob and Doris sat on the couch together after hugging, crying, and catching up for a few minutes. Bob told Doris everything that had happened to him, from being deployed to the front lines to being caught and returning home. He'd been battered and injured, but he believed his mother would find him, dead or alive. Doris loved her son for his bravery in the face of such tragedy, and after all, she was very proud of him.